time. So welcome to the PSC seminar. Today we will hear from Cagney, who is currently the director of the Institute of Social Research and professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. Kate has done some really backbreaking work on measurement of neighborhoods and neighborhood context in studies of health and aging across the life course and in different contexts. She's been pioneering measurements that are not just survey-based assessments, but different ways of measuring the built environment from systematic observations, also normal, like what we all do, measures of intensities, but she is also doing some innovative work on activity space among older adults using mobile technology of doing surveys and also geolocating the individuals in different environments throughout the days of their lives. She's doing some very important work on trying to figure out, used to thinking about measuring neighborhoods in urban areas and urban context. But that may be very different when we get into sort of small towns and rural areas. And so she's exploring how, or done some work now on how we actually measure activity space and neighborhoods in rural areas. So you're going to hear some new things that she's been working on. So please join me in welcoming Kate to
here for hosting and all of the video to meet with me and for this conversation today. Can you hear me? This is such a sophisticated microphone. It doesn't have any feedback at all, so I'm not even right. All done. It's such a nice opportunity to be here. And for those of you who may not know, I spent a very important sabbatical period here in 2016. And so I actually sort of feel like I'm embedded in my own department in some sense. And I know that's a bit of an overstatement, but it feels quite welcoming to me and familiar. And I also have appreciated over time the kinds of insights and ways I've learned from all of you. So that said, I hope we'll be relatively informal in interaction. If there's a point of clarification, please jump in. I've been in Michigan for 3 years, but was at the University of Chicago for 20. And so I'm quite used to a different kind of normative orientation toward a seminar, we'll just say, right? Where people not only would interrupt the speaker, but interrupt one another. So you should feel free to employ those rules as well. And yeah, I hope we'll have a great conversation. I'm aiming to finish around 20 a quarter of it so that we'll have some time for conversation. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about activity space, urban rural comparisons, and measurement challenges, which there are many. And this is a little bit different for a demography seminar. I'm actually going to spend some time talking about new methods in social surveys. I've shared a bit about this last night, but I'm quite concerned about the future of the social survey. I'm going to tell you some reasons why. I'm quite committed to asking people questions. I still think it's important to understand what people think and how they feel. I think the discordance between what people do and what they say is really interesting. We can't get to discordance if we're not actually querying individuals. And so trying to think about new ways where we make certain the social survey survives, but also augment those data in new and interesting ways to get to important insights in the social sciences. So that's essentially my setup for today. So I want to attempt to address when we need to ask questions and when we might prefer to use sensors to track. I'm going to talk about different methods in that way. I want to lay out theoretically informed approaches that might suggest new methods. And I want to make certain that the method is not in search of the question. So what questions are we asking? What informs them? I have a friend who spent a lot of time at NASA, and I was telling him about my activity space work, and he said, is it mission pull or technology push? I thought that was clever. That's why I put it on the slide. I thought it was a great, but I like this idea that I want to try to assess where people go and what they do. I'm very interested in questions. I'll show you some results related to this in a moment, but for instance, are our days as segregated as our nights? What are the ways we can use these kinds of methods to get at new insights about our social and behavioral sciences? So that is my motivation. Okay, I put up the book by Norman Bradford for my University of Chicago colleagues in the room because they would remember Norman well, who ran the National Opinion Research Center and also was a provost at the University of Chicago and read some very important work thinking about what do questions do for us in social surveys. He was the one who really sort of introduced an important insight about getting at the positive social aspects of our lives, that there's a distribution. It's not just that we're all well and then there are decrements to that wellness, but really that variation on the right side of the distribution. And so I still turn to this work in asking about what's a reliable and valid manner to measure social phenomenon. What's the art of asking questions? When might it succeed? When might it fail? And actually, I'm going to show you a bit of a failure in one of the three components that we walked through today. And I'm very interested in your insights. I gave Irma 30 seconds sidebar. She already had a hypothesis for why some of our questions might not work, but I will show you that in a moment. So you can actually see that on the top I see, but this what it says is when asking questions might not be so effective. So we get this motivation from people like Norman Bradford. Well, thanks for whatever you're about to do, which I feel now I should have been able to do myself after all these years with Zoom.
Well, that's what these are around, so they need to show you.
I'll move it around, should we need it. So this is just to show, this actually comes out of a study in Columbus, Ohio with youth, some work that Chris Browning did, where we were looking at traditional recall and then GPS data. And this is just a quick illustration that through GPS tracking for those adolescents, we get a lot more information than what they were able to recall at the end of the day. And so for traditional recall activities, augmenting with other kinds of mechanisms to assess where people go, what they do may be really important for our science and our data, and also help us prompt individuals in terms of their level of experiences because we're able to track people in this manner. So I made an argument that asking questions is really important, asking questions of individuals even more so. I was sharing with Paula earlier that I went to a National Academies meeting a couple of weeks ago where some of my survey methodology those colleagues were making an argument about synthetic respondents, that maybe we should use synthetic respondents in our surveys. And they're saying, is it really that different from imputation? And I said, I think so. You know, like, it's a little bit different than imputation, but it's an interesting kind of idea, right? I'm not so comfortable with the idea of synthetic respondents, and so want to think again about ways that we would augment these data. Was anybody else in the room familiar with this discussion about social surveys in this manner? So it's relatively new.
What is the synthetic respondent?
So you actually AI creates the respondent for you rather than going to the house and getting the data yourself. So I find that troubling. I'm admitting to the room. And you know, for a place like the Institute for Social Research, which very much relies on respondents in our social surveys, it's just an interesting way to think through what's the role of AI. And I'll just say as an aside, we had our 75th anniversary about 10 days ago, and a lot of discussion about social surveys and their role. And somebody said, what's your Tesla moment? Someone asked me that question. What's the Tesla moment in the social survey world? And so this idea that GM wasn't prepared for what Tesla would bring to the market. And so in some ways, as survey methodologists, what are we not prepared for in this way? And I wondered whether AI creating my respondents is a turning point, right, in how we think about social surveys. But I digress. So anyway, but at least that gives you the underpinnings of some of the reasons why I think it's really important to be having these conversations. Now I learned from you, right, that I just need to move the mouse if this is, oh, and it worked, great. Okay, these are the current challenges to asking questions. Some of these I've already foreshadowed: declining response rates, increasing field costs, limitations related to in-person data collection. We learned a bit of that over COVID, so we used some of our activity-based methods during a period of time, and then potentially disincentives to innovate. That's going to motivate two of the pilot projects I'm going to talk about today, where we want to insert something innovative within the a large-scale social survey to see where we might make some progress. And as we know, some of those are hard to alter. I pulled these data. These are response rates from the General Social Survey from 1975 to 2021. What do you note? It's not looking great, right? Over a relatively short period of time. I mean, if you look at those response rates in 1995, that 17.4 was for the cross-sectional component, but still very concerning, right, in terms of the way we're thinking about our social surveys. Okay, so as I said, I'm gonna talk about 3 assessments that speak to these challenges. So new methods for asking questions that capture space and time more accurately, using activity space, GPS and ecological assessment. I'm not going to speak a lot about the data that come from those aspects of the data collection enterprise, but I do want to show you one illustration. And then, as Irma noted, I want to focus a bit on rural life and thinking about rural urban comparisons. I think certainly within sociology, there hasn't been adequate attention, I think, to rural life. I feel like certainly in conversations about our electoral politics right now, we don't have a lot to anchor some of our suppositions on in terms of large-scale data collection that speaks to rural life. And even in our studies like the health and retirement study or the PSAD, we don't have great representation of rural residents. And so I think it's an important time period in which we want to think about some concentrated data collection in rural space. And I'm going to show you one example. Okay, so I'm going to take just about 5 minutes and talk about sociological understanding the impact of place. So I would describe myself as someone who does neighborhood effects research. I'm interested in understanding neighborhood social processes and how they matter for health outcomes in particular for older adults. But there are certainly limitations in the characterization of that space and the circumference of turf, how we think about the microenvironment. Some of this reminds me, and one of the reasons I was quite interested in this work is thinking about isolated older adults and isolated neighborhoods, thinking of some of the early work of Wilson, where he talked about neighborhoods having these sort of layers of social isolation. And I think an aging context helps us sort of think through the implications of that. And then just asking, can new methods provide insight into what place is, how it's perceived, how it might matter? And again, for thinking about health stats. So theoretical approaches have largely neglected that actual spatial exposure. And so this is really meant to integrate social disorganization theory. I'm thinking about some work from Jane Jacobs. How many of you are familiar with Death and Life of Great American Cities? So I encourage the students in the back of the room to read Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's Rittenhouse Square, she writes about here, right? And that park is being optimal in terms of social integration, maintaining some privacy in that park, but also sort of, the animation of everyday life and why that park is so important to the health and well-being of Philadelphia. So just as an aside, you might enjoy reading it. But incorporate, that conceptualization and think about these individual level exposures. So this really comes from a lot of this old Chicago school theory, thinking about neighborhood structure, how it matters for neighborhood outcomes through particular mechanisms. So it's sort of old Chicago school theory from the last century, Shaw, McKay, Park and Burgess, and others who looked at those structural features like segregation, economic status, educational attainment, how that mattered for particular outcomes through mechanisms like social cohesion, informal social control, which are contemporary elaborations that came from Rob Sampson, others, Wilson, who I just mentioned, but also incorporating issues of culture and notions of disorder, some of which comes from the theory of Skogan. So where this falls short, and this is very simple schematic, but where it falls short is you have sort of a neighborhood that's not adjacent. So people like Luke Anslin have come up with these really nice methodological insights for adjacent neighborhoods to think about spillover effects and the way we think about it both substantively and statistically. Mary Patillo has some great work on the conceptual level, thinking about how The economic status of adjacent neighborhoods matters for the local neighborhood and whether it shores it up or draws resources from it. But it's been difficult to kind of understand. Sometimes this has been characterized as third places, but other places where people spend time and how they're also influential, particularly during the activity patterns of one's daily life. So then just to think about sort of a synthetic model, again, coming up with these measures that are structural: segregation, poverty, residential instability, race and ethnic heterogeneity, how they might matter for organizations and amenities, and how, other factors like population density, immigrant concentration matter too, and whether they animate the street. That again is some nice insight that came from Jane Jacobs' work that contemporary social scientists like Sampson and others, as they characterized collective efficacy theory, but thought about these notions like a web of public trust. What creates that kind of connectedness in community? And I'm really interested, this is sort of separate work, but how these theories apply in a rural social context. Because we still imagine, right, social cohesion, certainly informal social control, measures of disorder are present in rural social contexts. And so how do we capture that? So we've actually incorporated some of those measures into the Great Smoky Mountain study, which I will describe in a moment. So this is our team from our Chicago-based work, and some of these people are also helping us think about this work in rural areas. And this is just to tell you what the structure of this study was. We've had 6 waves of data collection in the field. We had an in-person questionnaire. We also did biomeasures. So we did blood spots in the home, other health questions, behavioral questions. And then we had 3 waves of data collection initially, and then we did 3 waves during the COVID period. We also did EMA 5 times a day. 5 times a day was too many. Has anyone done EMA in the room?
What is EMA? What is it?
Sorry, ecological momentary assessment. So it is that phone. And we beat people randomly 5 times a day and ask them. It kind of comes in large part from theory from Csikszentmihalyi and this idea of flow. And so instead of saying, were you depressed over the last week, you ask someone, are you depressed? So it gets at in the moment assessments rather than that are more conventional and social survey that are retrospective. Has anyone done ecological momentary assessment in the room? Yeah, we were, I think, at the time novel in terms of incorporating ecological momentary assessment with the GPS tracking, with also doing biomeasures and an in-person data collection effort. So we have a lot of data. If anyone's interested in these kinds of data collection efforts, I can tell you all the things that went wrong with that to save you some time. Because the GPS didn't always communicate so well with the EMA. There were lots of things that we had to do to adjust those processes. And so I always hope that I can save other people the effort. These are the Chicago neighborhoods that we selected. We selected them so that they would vary by race and social class. So we were purposeful in the selection of the neighborhoods. And then we will pull sample from within these. So you can kind of see. I was trying to move this little bar so you could actually see the that we. For those of you familiar with the city of Chicago, it is quite segregated by race. It's also segregated by social class. So we wanted to make sure we got some important variation there. Okay. So this is what the EMA looks like. So within those 10 neighborhoods, again, we follow people for 3 weeks, 1 week at a time with the GPS, and then we did the ecological momentary assessment. We asked, where are you, who you're with, doing what, symptoms of stress and mood, social and physical characteristics, disorder. What we wanted to do was really get at this notion. So I mentioned collective efficacy theory as a mechanism, so informal social control, social cohesion. We wanted to try to capture that for places you pass through, not just places you live. And so that was what was novel about this kind of approach, is saying I still get a vibe in this neighborhood when I'm moving through it. And so we wanted to be able to collect data in that way. We also, in the spirit of Norman Bradburn, wanted to get at some things that were pro-social in the neighborhood. Yeah, please.
You said two was, there was too many throughout the day, so was that because there wasn't, people didn't want to respond, or because there was not added information that you got from those extra two?
We thought it was too much, that people felt like 5 times a day was a lot to be asked who you're with, what are you doing, how do you feel? And also, you know, we didn't have as much variation. I mean, this is an older adult population, and so, you know, about 70% of our population at any one time is at home. So that speak to us, that spoke to the need for things like actigraphy within the home environment to get within. But we also just felt it was taxing. Indeed, once people about 70% of our respondents did adhere, and they decided to fill out those EMAs all week long. They also did get some remuneration for it, but there was a lot to ask. Indeed, this is what one person said. One of the funniest things is that I was at church when it pinged, but I had accidentally left it at home. So I got home and it had rung, and I thought I was not home, I was at church. I'd been at home a lot when it rang. So I got back in my car and I drove back to church. Which is, of course, like not what you want, right? But it is a sort of interesting thing about, you know, and this comes up a lot. How does the, you know, the use of the EMA itself alter the data collection enterprise? Something we have to think about. We've thought about it a lot in training, you know, making certain that people knew that their identities would not be connected to these data at all. But it also made us sensitive, particularly in an older adult population, about the extent to which they felt some stigmatized notion from being alone. They felt like this notion of I was caught alone a lot. And so we wanted to make people feel more comfortable describing exactly what they were doing and who they were with. And that aloneness was a perfectly fine state.
So can I ask you just a clarification question? So you gave people some devices to use for all this study, and why didn't you just do it on a phone app?
So this
Isn't it easier just, things, your phone is in the church and you avoid exactly these issues?
So for our Great Smoky Mountain study, that's exactly what we did. We're in the field right now with that. And at this time, we started it in 2016, 2017. Most of our older adults did not have smartphones. And so, disproportionately a lower income population. There were issues then of pushing out an app and doing the GPS and doing the EMA. So we just sent people phones. And it was only, so some people had to carry 2 phones. That had some complexity to it. Now we would feel more comfortable just pushing out the app.
It was on the phone. Or you just gave them the phone, so it was a phone app then too.
Yeah, but only that app. It wasn't an app on their own phone. Sorry, yeah, it was an app on, and that was the only thing on there. One person hacked it and called Denmark. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, no one did anything wrong with the phones. So that's kind of how it played out. But that's a great question. And now we just push out an app. Okay, so I'm just going to show you 2 examples from these data, and then I want you to sort of imagine how this project then has shaped what we're doing in the Great Smoky Mountain study currently. So this is just to show you again from my colleagues who have spent time in Chicago. These are our 10 neighborhoods, and this shows you where people moved in the course of a week. And so just to sort of for illustration, Irving Park is relatively higher income, primarily white. And East Side is primarily African-American Latino, relatively lower income. And what you can kind of see from this schematic is that our upper income whites typically sort of stayed north or went to Wisconsin. And our lower income Latino and African-American respondents either stayed south or went to Indiana. So it's sort of an interesting, again, it's a descriptive illustration, but fascinating to me in terms of the concentration of where people spent time, that pattern activity, and the extent to which the heuristic here is that they sort of spent time in same race space. And so that's sort of what we motivate with this kind of analysis. And then I just wanted to give a shout out. This is a paper Leanne Kai, who's a graduate student at University of Chicago, who worked very closely on this project. It just came out in Social Forces. looking at race and the extent to which, right, we interact during the day. And again, sort of this notion that when we think about racial integration, we mostly think about residential racial integration, but not racial integration in how we spend time during the day. And in his work, he's able to show, he did this really nice, if anybody wants the paper, I'm happy to send it, clean contiguity kind of analysis, looking at first order, second order, third order neighbors, where people are spending time, and adjusting. So we're not just doing an MSA adjustment, we're doing an adjustment for where people are actually interacting with neighbors and the composition of those neighborhoods. And I'll just say the upshot of this analysis is one of compelled mobility to some extent. So that means that our African-American respondents find themselves in spaces that are dominant white, but the reverse is not occurring. So that, I think, makes sense to us from the standpoint of thinking about resource allocation and amenities and where people spend time. But it's also interesting from the standpoint that our daily lives are a bit more integrated than where we stay at night, but not a lot more. So I'll likely get back to this in a moment, but it was important motivation for how we think about this notion of compelled mobility, how one is pulled into space that is not sort of the space with which they are spending time, generally from a residential standpoint, how that might help inform the way we think about research at rural life. So these are the extensions. So now we're shifting gears, and now we're going to talk about the Great Smoky Mountain Study and two pilot projects that are related to that. Are y'all with me? Okay, great. So I'll just say, yeah, many people know this in the room, but I think that, I grew up on a farm between Kalamazoo and Battle Creek. It's personal information to share, but it also has made me think. I spent 20 years studying urban sociology, but it's interesting to kind of work through the communities in which I was reared and think about how some of these principles might matter. So a lot of this we know about rural life, relative populations fallen, age structures higher. Many people, disproportionate share, live in their state of birth, lower ed levels, poorer health. So a lot of reasons to study rural life. How many of you had heard of the Great Smoky Mountain Study of rural aging, or the Great Smoky Mountain Study? Anybody spent time at Duke? So you knew a little bit about it. It's started by psychologists at Duke University in 1993 with a sample of 1,400 kids, including 350 from the tribal community that is adjacent to this space near Asheville. So it's one of the only studies in the United States that has a longitudinal data on tribal community and composition of children. Right now, we are funded by NIA. I was mentioning this last night. NIA has picked us up. And like Ad Health, we have become a midlife study. And so I think it's a really nice opportunity. These respondents now are about this age of Ad Health. And they are disproportionately sicker than some of the Ad Health respondents, it turns out. And so the deaths to despair work, and I know some people have been digging into that here. And Irma's, yeah, but there are some motivating features about that make us think about whether adults in midlife are, experiencing decrements of health in a different way than their urban counterparts. So you can see this is opioid and heroin use by our participants, which has ticked up into their 30s. But we're interested in some of these measures of despair, gig economy, and in comparing these measures. So this is where we are. Many of you know that this is also the place where the hurricane just went through. And so we have been in the field. We're not in the field at the moment because all of this area, right, has been, under great stress in recent weeks. Counties. These are the data that have already been collected on these individuals, lots of things that you would imagine: administrative records, geospatial data, blood spots, hormones, stress, DNA genotyping. What are we adding? Because now it's an aging study. We're adding health risk, cognition, blood spots, and an EMA protocol. So again, ecological momentary assessment, but over a wider age and time period. So we're doing it every 6 months to get at labor market activity. Because it's an interesting insight into the gig economy and particularly seasonal work. So we want to try to capture that in rural space, ethnography samples and the like, and also sort of the neighborhood measures. Ira was just asking me about this. We adapted those 8 neighborhood measures that were originally in the Project on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods for the HRS, and now we're adding them to the Great Smoky Mountain study.
And what kind of hotspots are you collecting and what kind of analysis do you plan to do?
So, we're doing them through dry blood spots. And right now Epstein-Barr, and other measures of stress hormones. I'm not quite as involved in that side of it, but we're going to continue to store them and also do DNA methylation. So, Bill Copeland is the PI and is leading that portion of work. So we wanted to ask whether activity-based methods could work in rural areas. So we used an adjacent study. This is a pilot with only 162 cases. But we wanted to be able to see, we could pull those data right away. This was during the pandemic. And we weren't yet in the field with the Great Smoky Mountains. So we used an adjacent study, the RAISE study. Recoil is the PI. We just wanted to see, like, do those phones work, right? Is there connectivity? Can we track? So we did now we only did it 3 times a day, the EMA. So we learned from the Chicago study, 5 was too many. Final survey, passive data collection with GPS. And then we asked a rural perception question. And this was just something we decided to do in a meeting, and it ended up being important to us. How would you describe where you live and how would most people describe it? This slide I'm showing, because these are the kinds of data that one would collect if you wanted to see whether GPS data collection would work. Time gap, distance, accuracy, temporal coverage, number of days, GPS points. This is just to validate, but I want to make sure I say if anybody wants to do work of this form, don't use an Android. Go iOS. As you can see, look at the device differences in timing. So these are again important kinds of things that are just descriptive in nature, but the data quality is not as good with the Android. And this is where we used ecological momentary assessment as validation, where we have a high level of agreement between an EMA, so people are reporting the location, and the GPS derived location. So those darker bars are essentially saying, yes, those are in sync. So it's a nice way to use GPS and EMA together to just make sure that the GPS is working, essentially, because we tend to think about where people are as the validation anchor. So we're happy to say that was we're glad to see that the connectivity worked. We were a bit surprised in a way, and that this age group would actually both allow the GPS tracking and the ecological momentary assessment use. And we had between 70–80% response rate on the EMA. So that gave us some confidence that we could do this in the full-blown study. But this is where we were caught a little bit. So this is, I don't know how many in this room have done some work with rural research, or Irma has, I know. Anybody else think about rural designations? These are RUCA codes. The top 3, as you can see, are urban. The rest we're kind of considering rural, suburban, rural. So this is the primary designation people use to distinguish rural and urban context. But this led us to a question of what is rural and what does it mean? And so the existing literature, place-based continuum, using RUCA codes, also commuter codes, population density, distance to urban cores. But there just seemed to be a lot of heterogeneity and experience of rural individuals. And so what is actually perception of rural identity? What does rural really mean? And within sociology, we felt like it's more spatially attuned to urban research for lots of different reasons, including data availability. So we wanted to see if we could explore this a bit. And so we did look at whether there was a mismatch between the RUCA code and perceptions of rurality. And then we wanted to understand whether some of these mobility patterns were drivers of that. And we did indeed find, well, I'll show you now, that about 25% of our respondents said they were rural residents, but actually lived in what was described as urban centers. Don't you think that's kind of interesting? And we were kind of, again, we were, we got into this work because we were really wanting to explore whether our activities-based measures could work. Do they work in rural contexts?
Yeah, this is not the Smoky Mountain study because you have people all over.
Yeah, so this is because our pilot came from the RAISE study.
Okay,
So
so that was all over North Carolina.
Yeah, those data were all, yes, exactly. Thank you for saying that. So this is just to remind you, so I'm just going to show you something on convex hull and standard deviation ellipse here. Those are conventional ways that we think about characterizing spatial data descriptively. And what's interesting here is, both in the unique census tract visited, the convex hull, standard deviation ellipse, it looks like people's spaces that they inhabit are about the, relatively the same. Not surprisingly, people in urban spaces spend more time in other census tracts. Census tracts are smaller, they might be commuting larger distances, all those kinds of things. So all of that makes sense to us. But what's so interesting to us is that this group seems somewhat distinct. In those who say they live in urban space, but say they're rural. They seem to spend time in different spaces and they operate a bit more like their rural counterparts, but they're different. And I'm going to show you again what I mean.
Okay, so one question I have, the counties are based on the population, right? But they could be living close, this is your boundaries, right? But they may be living very close to a rural county on the boundary of the urban area, and they spend their time in the rural area.
Right, but what's interesting, so we looked at that, and what's interesting is that very few are actually the people who sit at the edges. And that's interesting, right? Because we also thought, of course, there are people who are on those boundaries in some way. But that seems not to dominate. This one in the interest of time. This shows us the number of unique tracks people are spending time in, the average length track. This comes, so what we ended up doing, so we had the pilot data, then these are SafeGraph data, the next two. So what we did was we took are you guys familiar with SafeGraph data? These are data that are cell phone related data that can show population flows. So we really wanted to try to validate what we were seeing from this small pilot with SafeGraph data. We don't have individual level data from SafeGraph, but you can see in degree and out degree movement from the SafeGraph data. And what the SafeGraph data suggests to us is that this group that identifies as rural but lives in urban space, their SafeGraph counterparts are operating the same way, have the same kind of circumference of turf, seem to be spending time primarily in the space in which they have residential locations, spend a little more time in rural space, but are distinct from both the rural counterparts and their urban counterparts. That's really the upshot of that analysis, but the SafeGraph data did at least help us think when you're dealing with pilot data and it's such a small number, at least we had another way to validate these movements and patterns of activity. We're still trying to think through. This is also showing the out degree and in degree, and those SafeGraph flows and the green bars again are both rural, but we're trying to understand who are these people. And so one of the ways that we try to get at who are these people and what are they up to is to get point of interest data. So we did that through the National Center of Education Statistics, Open Data, OpenStreetMap, to try to understand where are people spending time? How and why are these people different? And it turns out to tell us very much. Actually, so after all of that data linkage, not much. They look about the same in terms of their patterns, and I'll just show you something that's a bit more detailed. So this is the group where the ruck is urban and the south is rural. So these are the people we're kind of puzzled about. So we see a significant difference in exposure to urban churches. That's not such a surprise. And a significant difference to exposure to rural points of interest and to urban retail. Not a big surprise, but their life patterns don't seem to be so dissimilar. So just to sort of recap in this way, what we were trying to do was understand, I was trying to motivate this work from activity-based research first done in urban context in a rural area, using a pilot that would inform the Great Smoky Mountain study, being puzzled that some of these people who are supposed to be, urban in some sense, describe themselves as rural. Why? And then trying to use other forms of data to bring insight, both through SafeGraph and through these, various point of interest data, again, that we can get through SafeGraph and adjacent data sources. And we're still puzzled. So, one of the things we want to try to do is unpack this. They have a unique pattern of activity space. They spend meaningful time in rural census tracts, but they're closer to their urban group in many other kinds of ways, and systematically different levels of point of interest utilization. So we're still trying to kind of sort through.
Are these the tracks that were adjacent to the?
We're
Adjacent to the metro areas,
which tracks, I'm sorry.
the ones that they say they rural when they live in the.
No, they weren't. Which is right. So we're trying to understand more about the nature of the venues people visit, other factors, residential stability, residential tenure, upbringing. We think it might be interesting to do some qualitative work and try to unpack how people identify, understanding more with alternative data sources. But any quick insights from the group? Yeah, great.
I'm curious about internal migration, because you'd think that someone who has moved out of the city might, feel like they've ruralized when they're really still living in an urban area. So just things like that.
I think that's where we just really need to dig in a little bit more and try to understand, is there something about being urban that's cultural? And being rural that's cultural, yeah.
Could be something about like how you are measuring like rural and urban.
That's right, what?
How you are measuring rural and urban, like in the definition itself. And if you measure rural in a different way, it could be changed.
So we did, so I'm glad you asked that, and we used RUCA codes. We've used only administrative codes to measure it, but we use the commuting codes. We've used other sort of coding mechanisms to try to understand, and we still come up with the same result. It doesn't mean you couldn't measure it in a wholly different way than what these administrative resources afford us, but we may not be, that's one undercurrent of this work, is that we may not be capturing it.
Can you just clarify how the question, the self-reported question was asked? You would say, do you reside in a rural
Yes.
area, or do you feel, how was it phrased?
Yeah, do you live in? And then would other people describe it that way? Those were correlated at 93. So it's both what you think and what you think others would think. And that's what we used. Yeah.
Was there any specification, others from where? Like others like your family members, others like national
No.
scale?
No, that's a great question. No, just others. Yeah, that's the only way to characterize it.
Yeah, well, so I listened to a presentation by David Grosky and his students last year. They used the SafeGraph microdata. So they have the individual level movement patterns. So if we have this large scale, the cell phone GPS data, what will be the importance of collecting those smaller scale, this data, in addition to you mentioned that, and probably the pink, those pop up our EMA data collection.
Yeah, I would love to get those data, right? So you're saying that he has the individual level data.
Right, yes, seems those data can also answer the questions you proposed here. at least for this project, but probably for other projects, you still need to collect the data, the EMA or other things like household.
Yeah, I'll have to dig into it. My understanding is that he has sort of a particular access, to, right? Or a form of the SafeGraph data, yeah, that aren't readily available. But,
Oh, I see, okay. So they don't really sell their data, you need to work with them,
Yeah.
how do you say? It's to get much data.
okay, I'm just gonna take about, if I may, like 3 minutes to tell this other story. So one of the reasons, so we worked through, again, kind of, here's a study we did in urban social context. Are there motivating features about it that could bring insight into this rural research? We feel confident that it works, but then we found this other odd result. And so are we actually studying rural individuals? We had to step back and ask. And then but the other motivation, this is the work I do with Joe Hotz, is to think carefully about how we're using our longitudinal data sources and are we really digging into them and using them effectively. So are we taking risks? I think about things like the PSID and the HRS. Are we trying to do things that will, again, sort of bring innovation to our social surveys and make sure that we're sort of kept apace so that AI doesn't create our respondents? And so one of the things we wanted to do is we did what we called a rapid assessment, a quick study to try to understand, are we confident about our retrospective assessments? What's really great about the Great Smoky Mountain study is that we ask for reports when kids are 9 to 13, and we ask for reports from their parents. Now in this current wave, when they're in their 40s, we ask them the same questions. And we want to see if they give the same answers. And to our knowledge, no other longitudinal data study has done this. We're still digging around a little bit, but there aren't that many longitudinal data opportunities. And we thought this was a really interesting kind of experiment to understand the extent to which we can feel confident in our data. So this was what we ended up doing. We were just going to look at whether this worked with 50 respondents. We ended up just incorporating this into all of our data collection. We have about a third to a half of our data collection done right now, so 580 and counting. These are the kinds of things we looked at: high magnitude trauma, low childhood diagnoses, serious childhood infection, functional impairment, perceptions of health, hospitalization. Some high magnitude events: death of a close relative, witness to a traumatic event, natural disaster, parental divorce. Okay, so I'm going to show you, this is agreement between, so pro-self means that's prospective and that's the respondent. And that's pro from the parent, and then perspective from both. And you can see that we don't have great agreement. And this is fascinating to us. And I'm gonna skip the next one because these are of lower weight, but the blue and the red essentially show like it's higher for terminated pregnancy, low for parental separation. And so this is just asking people, did your parents separate? And then I want to show you these three. We're going to skip that one for now, but level agreement on sexual abuse, 0.39, physical abuse, 0.28, and natural disaster, 0.13. So why I show you these is to say that we're asking them now what happened when they were children. But we asked those kids when they were kids at the time. And so we're concerned that there is so little agreement between the prospective and retrospective assessments. And so we did something else. We used anchoring, and maybe others have used this in social surveys. Sorry, that's small. So we had them kind of try to remember other sentinel events. Where did you live? What were you doing? What schools did you attend at these different points in life? So there's some really nice life history calendars, other kinds of things that are used in this way to help people anchor. And we thought that this would make a difference. And it turned out it made no difference at all. So what is fascinating to us here is that retrospective recall, again, 2 to 3 decades after the fact, only suggested agreement, and only for a few specific items. Like it was higher for things like abortion, but as you saw, lower for things like physical abuse. for most items, and those were particularly the lower magnitude events, agreement was really low. But it seems not to be an issue of forgetting, because some of the rates for the retrospective assessments are twice as high as they were reported in the moment. So why? So we think that maybe there was new information from parents. Parents shared information that you weren't aware of when you were a kid. Gaps in assessment, new interpretations of old events. We can think about things like, many of the narratives from the Catholic Church, for instance, and kids' retrospective, adults' retrospective assessments of that interaction when they were children would fall in that category. Reluctance to report as a child, rapport with the interviewer, I raised this earlier. These are face-to-face interviews in the Great Smoky Mountains study. We've had some of the same interviewers for 30 years. There may be reasons you wouldn't want to share that information. And our efforts to improve recall by getting people to work through these kinds of, that calendar assessment to get them to anchor did not change the numbers that I showed you. So I share this in part because I just think it's really interesting. And I'm interested if anybody else, we just finished this analysis, has had this kind of experience with data of this form, but also to kind of encourage us to think carefully about the kinds of questions we're asking in social surveys, to be sharing information with one another about the things that don't work. And that's been sort of an essential element of the work I've been doing with Joe Hutz through the Chablis Center on Aging at the University of Chicago, was to get our large-scale studies to come together and to reveal the things that haven't been successful in the field. And I think this is one of them, and we're really trying to unpack why that's the case. And I can close there. I mentioned the qualitative work, thinking about virtual spaces, but also just thinking broadly about innovation in social surveys and hoping I left you not with the feeling that you have the data, because look, but that there is some promise, particularly in augmented data. So I'll close there.
We have some time for questions. Are there any other questions that?
I just wonder if like the specificity of the question mattered very much. So, did you have an abortion is a pretty objective measure. When you say, did your parents separate versus did your parents ever live in two households or something like that? Did you not live under the same roof? Like if you have measures that seem more objective versus subjective, and whether there's differences in discordance there.
So the language was the same in the two kinds of assessments. I have to go back and look at the separation versus divorce. I think it was just divorce and not separation on the language of that query. But you're right. I think that's a nice point that did you ever have an abortion feels quite concrete, where you could imagine in a separation context that could take on different kinds of patterns.
I want to go back to the declining response rates that you showed at the beginning. And are these apps going to address that issue? I mean, do we get better data with these apps, or you still have the how would you address that now? It's increasing. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
For every data collection.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of evidence yet. The app-based surveys I know about are adjacent to a different kind of survey. So I don't know what it would look like just in its own right. There is a belief that people would be more responsive, particularly people at younger ages who are used to operating with only phones in a particular kind of context. And so there's a thought that will increase response rates. But my understanding from the survey methodologists is not by a lot yet. I don't think we have enough data yet.
But that last point on that, if I remember, was a web-based survey, that huge drop. So is that different? I don't know how the survey was collected before. Was it a telephone survey?
Yeah.
But if you look at the last drop, that was huge to the 17%. If I read that little line, that was a web-based survey.
Yeah, I think for that one, that was a little different because of COVID too. Yeah.
Right, so I wonder what the web-based, what is the experience of using combination of web and phone?
So I think, for the people at ISR who are doing this work, what they're really going through now is just all multi-mode. So if you're somebody who won't answer the phone, I'm gonna find you doing it in the web. If you're somebody who will do it on the web, I'm gonna, try to do something, that I hope will work in, I'll modify that web for this application. I think people are trying all sorts of things. Brady West at ISR has been doing a lot of work also just rethinking sampling and trying to get away from geography and sampling on just on cells, right? Not anchored to any kind of geography. People are trying everything, but that drop is still, so my understanding for the last GSS was, I think it was like at 32 or something like that. So it has maybe kicked up a little bit, but not a lot. And so that seems durable. What about the PSID? What are response rates most recently for PSID?
Well, they switched to web phone
Yeah.
mode, and they did take a big hit, the response rate the first time that they did it, but I think they have concluded they need both. There are people who are hard, who are users on both. Finding out one of the two, or two will
Yeah.
definitely do it the other way.
Discordance, between contemporary and the recall in the moment is really fascinating, but it seems like from what you're saying, some of them, they go in both directions. So some things are, you didn't talk about them when you were a child that you talk about now, and others you mentioned when you were a child and not now. So do you see some systematic pattern? Do you see a systematic pattern there?
No. Is the short answer. I mean, we've been trying to kind of think about, is it, do we see it go in one direction or the other for the things that we consider high trauma versus lower trauma? And so far, not a particular kind of insight in that way, but we're still trying to dig into the data to see, and also really looking at things like the last reported time period. The GSMS has had 11 waves. And so when that kid first, did the kid report at 9 or at 13 or at 17? And how might that inform some of the concordance discordance? And which parent reported? There are all these different kinds of things that you can try to unpack, and we're still actually looking at that. But I think what was surprising to us is that we saw no ready pattern and that we just saw low agreement.
If there is either child and the parent reporting the same event.
Yeah.
How discordant are those two reports?
So those are pretty. It depends a bit, but they're actually relatively high.
Because I can imagine
Just when
parents and
it's
children report different.
Yes, yeah. But that concordance was higher in that initial time period.
What did you, I thought you were fairly pessimistic about the future of social science surveys, social survey. And was
Don't
that,
tell anyone.
yeah, no, it stays in the room, but
Thank you.
but was that driven by just declining response rates or innovations that we can collect so much more data on individuals actually without surveying them? And anyways, wanted to elaborate a bit more on where you see this kind of survey going. Do we just ask fewer, more specific questions and get so much more data from whatever linkages and geospatial and a bunch of other stuff? Or
I think it's I didn't mean to, I don't see myself as a specific percent, just generally speaking. But I'm worried. I think maybe that's what you're hearing. And I'm worried that there have been certainly people within the survey methodology community that really feel like all of this is going to be replaced by data scraping, and that's an appropriate thing to do. There's a different contingency, and I'm in that group that really feels like, again, we still need to ask people questions. I do think we have to revisit the real estate of these instruments. We shouldn't be asking people anymore about duration of a hospitalization or diagnoses, right? Or rehospitalization timing. We should be able to get all of that through administrative records, just as a quick example. I know you're doing a lot of work with tax data, right?
So administrative, but I was also thinking about like a CPS. They often don't really follow people. They move to a different address. You have all this data, so you will be able to know where they move. So geographically, know how people change their work or their home address. So That's also a very important measure that the Census Bureau they collect.
Right, so those, yeah, so like that's a terrific example of something that I feel like really adds like richness to kind of the analysis we're gonna do. But, yeah, but I guess I am pessimistic about, about response rates. That I mean, and we talked about this a bit last night, that I am really worried. And some people really feel that at this time point, you know, people just won't open their doors anymore to anybody who they do not know. And the advent of the ring and other things, they're just, I guess we're wrapping up, but we're no longer, we can't list households anymore. So we have to come up, that's why Brady West's important work on sampling is essential, because we're not, you know, like the door-to-door listing of households. I think that part of social surveys has to be amended.
Okay, thank you very much. It's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.